Hey, what's going on, everyone? Thanks for joining us today for the 1004 show. We heard Todd Nuckols, founder of Lighthouse Labs, a top 25 accelerator in the country or the world?
Country. It's national ranking.
In the country, based in Richmond, Virginia. They have gone through 4 cohorts and are about to go through their 5th one as well. Todd, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
I like to ask hard questions here on the 1004 show. Food is an important part of communities, not one that people talk a lot about, though. But it's really a place of sense, and it's an experience. So, in Richmond, aka RVA, what is your favorite place to grab a bite to eat?
Oh, well, I am not the right person to ask. I'm not a foodie, so I'm a chain type of guy. So I do enjoy like a Chewy's, but I will say that the pork fries and the chocolate bar dessert at the Heritage place called Heritage is spectacular. Pork fries are amazing. Mozzarella stick with like a pork in it, that's money.
It sounds delicious. That makes
Very
sense, though, right? How food is such a big part of the culture and the experience around it. Is that something that you think, as Richmond is growing, the food scene is something that people are talking about more, or is it something
Absolutely.
completely?
Food plus craft beer equals apparently the right culture for good startup environments. And we've got both of that in spades. So it's a huge deal. As a matter of fact, our Chamber of Commerce is doing a web show strictly on the foodie scene in RVA. It's a big deal
Very
for sure.
cool. You started Lighthouse Labs 4 or 5 years ago, 2013, 2014 or so. How did the idea come about?
So through failure, of course, I actually applied with my co-founder to the very first TechStars class in Boulder, Colorado back in 2007. I got to the interview phase, met David Cohen, got rejected. That didn't pay a lot of bills, but it inspired me to later when I saw them spin out some best practices and ultimately create the Global Accelerator Network to join the fray and try to make it a little bit easier for the next person.
Interesting. What was the idea? Your idea?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea was, I mean, at the time it was strictly to do for-profit acceleration. So they were taking what they had learned out of the Boulder ecosystem. At that time, I think they had already expanded also maybe to Boston as a tier one program. Brad had written the book, Startup Communities, or was getting ready to write that book. And we were able to jump in. I think we were maybe like the 30th program to actually join what at the time was the Techstars affiliate network before it changed its name to Global Accelerator Network, and take those best practices into the local region. And in fact, couple that with a tip of the cap to you and the great work at Hatch. You actually inspired me quite a bit because you were one of the first people that invited me into the Startup America fray, and we ended up in Boulder, Colorado together. And I said, "Who's this guy, Zach? And he just breaks dishes and he does amazing things. And I wish I could be a little bit more like him." And that's a totally true story.
Do you still feel that way today?
I do. I do. I feel like, you've made me, you've inspired me to be a little bit more radical, which has been nice. And it's definitely wasn't my nature. And at the time, you probably had no clue what kind of influence you were exerting. But at the time, it was a big deal. And I remember spending that little time with you in Boulder and then coupling that with what we were doing in acceleration and what you were seeing in your own work. So we got to go for this. And so teamed up with 804 RVA, Larkin, Garby, which was a co-working community, and the rest is history, as they say.
You know, it's interesting as I look back and reflect on all of these things. I obviously remember those times with you. I think actually we got free plane tickets, and I gave you mine instead of you're like, "Are you sure?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, it's fine." But I look back, and that's I think 2012 at that point. So I think it's probably
Yeah,
like May of 2012, and so
it was.
that's 5 years ago. I was very naive back then, so you talk about me running through. Like I was like, "Oh, we'll figure all this out." I had no idea what we were doing, but it's crazy to think that still 5 years around, the stuff is still relevant. been able to work with thousands of businesses now. Um, but there's a core to it, right? It's like helping entrepreneurs do what they want to do. And I think there's something different with this type of work or creating these type of careers that is different than maybe your traditional style. And this is really kind of a for us, by us type of piece. Brad talks about this in his book, Startup Communities, which he's really become the godfather, if you think about it. It's incredible.
Sure.
But he talks about, leaders and feeders, and the leaders are the people that kind of create this movement. They create this. They're the entrepreneurs, the people that see an opportunity and go after it. And so, how did you're seeing other people do things? Do you think that you kind of look like these people, and you just say,
Sure.
let's go after it, or how did it get to kind of?
It's one of the main triggers for me. Obviously, I had the failure, lost some people's money. I tried the scale thing. It was particularly difficult in the Mid-Atlantic during the 2006-07 period, and shortly thereafter. Actually, when you were trying to go after it, it was probably one of the hardest times. And I was actually sitting in a room, and I was lamenting the fact that we were originally going to start as a for-profit fund. We're actually a nonprofit today. Don't take equity. But the investors had actually backed out on me and didn't want to do it. And look, I didn't know anything about managing a fund. I still probably wouldn't know anything about it today, as I'm a technologist by trade. But I was sitting in a room, and a fellow founder looked across the table and said, would it be better for these founders if they spent 13 weeks working together on their concepts? Would they be better at the end of the process, whether you give them money or not? Because I was just kind of crying in my milk about no one will fund us, and I can't get money for founders. And I said, it would be better. So we went with nights and weekends, and then that turned into 100 people at a demo day that saw that we could make a difference in a founder's life. And once you start making a difference in people's lives, it gets very, quote unquote, viral in the local system very quickly. I mean, people see you're trying to make a difference from a good place and join the ride. And that's basically what happened. So that was a trigger conversation for me. It wasn't that I thought I could do it. And I still don't think I can do it pretty much on a daily basis. And I'm still incredibly naive about what this is all going to become as the accelerator market advances and matures. But if we just stick with people and founders and trying to reduce barriers of entry to them in our local ecosystems, that can't be a bad thing. So we just got to keep at it and keep doing what we're doing. And hopefully people recognize that and respond accordingly, and we provide new opportunity.
Accelerators in my mind have become a buzzword, kind of like entrepreneurs and startups and starting a business. How does someone in your position try to stay relevant when everyone on the block is now trying to create one of these things? It's all I hear. I mean, there was 2,000 accelerators, I think, this year, and in my day there was 100. I
can't believe that we're at the top of any seed stage ranking with all the accelerator traffic that's out there. Staying relevant for us is staying very focused on being local plus. It's staying focused on founders and letting that message just kind of resonate. But for us, since we're a nonprofit and we don't take equity, that's clearly a differentiator. And while it presents its own sustainability challenges, and it's clearly something that a lot of accelerators don't do, they're still taking the 8%, the 9%, the 7%. They're trying to build a small fund and manage that small fund to success, which is extraordinarily difficult. So I think we do have some differentiation there. I think we also view it as kind of an educational community more than a platform for building a portfolio. And I think that provides a bit of an advantage as we talk to founders, the types of founders we can help, the types of mentors we can attract. Provides a bit of an advantage when we're not just trying to build a portfolio for a portfolio's sake or look at the top line valuation of a company. So I think those things are differentiators for us.
So you guys are one of the top 25 accelerators in the country off of the Seed Accelerator rankings. You guys are now there 2 years in a row. I love that.
Amazing.
No, it's awesome, and I think it's something that, like we were talking about. 5 years ago, we were like, "Hey, these are the things we're gonna do," and now we're like, "Hey, look, we did it," right?
Hey,
And I don't think we give ourselves enough credit, not necessarily you and I, but just looking back and being like, "Hey, we had this idea, we whether it went that way or not, that doesn't matter. What matters is that we stuck with it and we're pushing it through." And so you kind of as a startup founder of Lighthouse Labs and
yeah.
then talking to your founders, and I think this is something that's really important, is that you're going through it too. And so it's not something that you did before and you're playing mentor. It's like, no, I'm living this with you each and every day, and I think that gets lost a lot.
No, I think it's incredibly true. And I think you try to find people that are relevant. A lot of our best mentors are people that are going through it. And one of the value propositions that I tell founders from day one is the people that mean the most to you right now in your journey are probably the people in this room, other founders that are going through the same process, because the dynamics change very quickly in this marketplace, and you have to stay relevant with your process and how you're thinking about it. And founders that are going through the same stage are where you're going to find that relevance, as opposed to someone who may have done it and had an exit 10 years ago. It's just a different environment. So Lighthouse being a startup in and of itself, and one that's scrapping away, um, still hoteling for space and everything else under the sun. Yeah, it makes it kind of relevant and fun, and we can all be swinging in there together.
You have some fairly large businesses back you.
Yes.
How does that go down?
So it really starts by having a value proposition for them that is not money first. So for us, it was engaging them as mentors and engaging the networks that they represent. A lot of big corporations want to feel innovation or feel like they are innovative, and they know that they may not be. And so when they can expose their frontline people to innovation directly, it's a real benefit. And so we usually start by going into a large corporate partner and saying, the last thing I want to do is have a financial relationship with you. What I want to do first is invite you to be a mentor in the process, to connect us with your employees, to get them involved with founders on a founder to employee level. And this takes lots of shapes. For one of our companies this past year, they were tracking literally, now I will just tell you the metric. I haven't double verified it, but I was tracking one of our partners was tracking the number of services that they think they provided in kind, and it came up to about $1 million worth of services. So that's just the beginning. Now, once the corporate partner sees that, then they're like, well, we want this thing to work. And then obviously there are financial needs. And so it's pretty easy to have an ask at that point to say, look, you need to come alongside and support the work financially if you want us to continue to be able to have this type of platform for your employees and for our community. And then the conversation becomes fairly easy. Then they usually, for us, they'll start with something small, double down if it works, double down again if
Small
it
is how much?
works.
20, 25K?
Yeah, 20K, and then keep doubling
So they're betting on
year
the
over year.
community, right? So they've recognized that entrepreneurship and growing of small businesses and startups is important in their community, and that they, because they have been a successful business, can back that both in kind and in paid kind of sponsorships, so that then that can ultimately lift them and other people that might be interested in moving to your area are interested in getting behind it.
That's correct. It's a workforce recruitment tool. A lot of startups don't succeed, right? But they generate a lot of high capable people, and you start to get a density of those people running around. You start to see kind of a stronger workforce environment. Right alongside the craft beer and the food is, what is my technology? Yeah, what is my technology sector doing? And I think we're also beneficiaries of some timeliness in Capital One's culture. They're trying to evolve into more of a Google-like company than a bank. They want to talk about innovation a lot. They have set aside dollars nationally to do that in an internal project. They were born and raised out of Richmond, so their startup story was here. And that adds additional incentive to try to invest back into RVA. They still have a large corporate presence here. even though maybe the CEO suite is now in Northern Virginia. But they definitely want to be seen as an innovator. And what better way to be seen as an innovator is to support startups and high growth startups. And so it's been easy to tap that vein, and they've been very willing partners and very involved in the process. But again, even for them, wanting to establish an innovation edge, it was about starting as a partner through people first. And I think you got to keep that focus. If you go in just looking for the check, it doesn't work quite as well.
Love it. I don't know if you know this, but we have one large friend called Dominion Enterprises. They have a bunch of brands with them, and it's a very similar situation to you. It's let them see a little bit first, and then bring on the financial piece. And I remember it took us about 18 months to get them the first time, and I just wanted them to judge an event. And it was hard. It was hard to get that, but then we got it, and then we showed them, hey, this is why this is important. And met with some of those guys recently, and we got named to Time Magazine named Norfolk, Virginia Beach is the best place for millennials or something like that. Richmond was number 2, and so they were like, oh, you obviously had a huge piece of this, and this is one of the reasons why we get behind the things that you're doing. And I was like, that's interesting, because that's not like a quantifiable thing. It's more of a it's like more of a quantitative. Did I say that right?
I think close. Maybe not quant. It's subjective. Let's put it that way. Qualitative.
Yeah. So it was more of a qualitative thing. So it's better for the experience, a sense of community, and it's like, oh, that's really interesting, because that's something that it doesn't happen overnight, and I'm sure that because of the stuff that you've been doing, I saw that Capital One is bought a 6th-floor building. They're renovating that. They're making it part of a startup village, and you're starting to see these iconic spaces be a part of it. So it's interesting to see that. Jacob Geiger, I believe his name, used to be there, and he was a reporter for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Yes. I looked at him as a huge influential person to help get your message out there to millions of people. I know he's left since then, but how can someone kind of create? And I've heard the rumblings of, oh, we hate that he's gone because it's not, people don't talk about it as much. But how creating a relationship with a reporter can really help your little message be heard and seen by millions.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was a key figure for sure, and has since gone on to other ventures. But I think very early on, when you're just trying to establish any kind of brand or sense, if people can start seeing you, despite the fact the best part is my dad gets to see me in the paper, and he's excited about that. But if people start seeing you, it adds just a measure of credibility, right? So when you can be talked about in the press through earned media, you start to establish instant credibility, especially in a place as conservative as the Mid-Atlantic, and particularly RVA. Now, other people may not care what the paper has to say in other markets, but when you're talking about a fairly conservative established market that is not as excited about trending new ground, having an established organization like the Richmond Times-Dispatch speak about you and talk about your work. We've been followed by BizSense as well since then, which is kind of like the local blog outpost for business communication. You immediately get that sense of third-party validation, and it allows you to be something, right? I saw you in the paper still carries a little bit of weight, to be quite honest. And then it also provides your partners see that, and then they get the opportunity to have earned media as well. And while it's not as big a deal necessarily for one of our larger partners to be covered locally, I mean, positive press is positive press, and so you can take advantage of that.
How did you create the relationship with Jacob or any reporters?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, as you pointed out, he was a unique person. He was out looking for that relationship. Look, they need something to write about. It wasn't hard to create the relationship, but you had to show up where they were. So we have an event every year called Greater Richmond Companies to Watch. He was very involved in that. And so going and supporting that event and being in that event became, a point where you can have that access and that informal conversation that then turns into PR down the road. So, you hear a lot of people say, write the story for them. You didn't have to do that necessarily with Jacob, but you had to be visible enough. You can't just sit in a corner. You had to be visible enough and interested in what they're interested in. So when they're reporting on Greater Richmond companies to watch, if one of those companies could be a Lighthouse company or someone that we are associated with, you just created these natural storylines and it kind of evolves from there.
Very cool. Why should a business apply to an accelerator? What's in it for them?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's all about the power of the network, right? And there's table stakes. And if you have a very limited network or you just have limited friends and family access, that's why you should go to an accelerator. But you can't look, just like vanity metrics, they're vanity networks, right? So you really need to look at a network that can actually do something for you. So it's one thing even to go to like a Techstars or et cetera and think, wow, that's a great network, but can you work it? Is it going to be meaningful? So the one thing that we ask all of our evaluators to do at Lighthouse, the number one question, and we tell founders this all the time, that we're asking when we look at you is, can we help you? Because we're not necessarily in the situation to help every founder, good or bad idea. And so with that curated conversation, you now have a mentor network that knows they can do something for you. Well, I mean, basically, when you're looking through the application process, our application process is such that our pre-screening and our interview people is drawn directly from our investors and our mentors. So I don't make the individual decision myself. That group makes the decision. So in that process, they are constantly asking themselves the question, do I have someone in my personal network that can really move the ball from a customer relationship standpoint? Because getting those customers is what we kind of value, right? Coming through the process. So I think for any founder going into an accelerator, it's about, yes, capital. I mean, if you have none, right? I mean, $20,000 in our case with no equity is nice, sets you up in a decent position to get through the program. Sometimes it's enough capital to be full-time for the first time, which for many founders, accelerators can help you focus. And ruthless focus is critical. And then they open up this instant network. So for our founders, they're going to have 40 conversations right out of the gate that they didn't have to go work for, hustle for. They're just there. 40 conversations of which, a handful of them are going to be game changers. And so that's I think what you get when you come through an accelerator. And the last thing you get, I mean, for us is the founder to founder relationship, which I think is invaluable. I mean, knowing other people are in your same boat is very good, especially with all of the mental grind that goes on with starting a startup. So being able to relate to those people and have them bring their collective networks to bear on your problems is good. So we're not curriculum based. I mean, we're really focusing on just trying to get into the founder's head, understand where their next step needs to be, and hopefully curate a conversation that'll make that next step a reality.
Is the point when people say don't just take a check from someone if they can't help you, is that kind of the same effect where it's like, we won't take a company if we know that we can't move them forward? I mean, is it similar to that?
It's very similar to that. We don't, we'll pass on ideas that are probably very good ideas. We're just the wrong market. We're the wrong people. We have the wrong network. In our world, early monetization is important in the mid-Atlantic. And to investors that are even doing the smallest seed stage investments, they like to see early revenue opportunities. So sometimes market share grabs or larger B2C plays are difficult for us to actually motivate forward. We know the investment potential is not sitting there right at the end of the accelerator. We know that our mentors haven't come from that background necessarily. In some cases, where there's some alignment, that can still work, but we have to make that decision pretty carefully. So with us, you've seen a lot of B2B businesses and things that have more early monetization, even if they are B2C or B2B2C.
I think that's smart. I think that a lot of people, it's weird. People don't care about making money anymore, it seems like sometimes. And I'm like, guys, you got to make money. And we're in Virginia, so you definitely have to make a lot of money. So you guys aren't taking the next social network, if you will. Oh, what you have. So you have.
I mean, no, we're not. Okay. We're not. I mean, so I'm showing a little bit of my bias. I mean, that's certainly not where I am. If a founder has worked hard and created traction. And even though it's say a pure B2C play, and we do believe that maybe they've already worked with an investor in ecosystem or mentor in ecosystem, and we feel like we can add value there. We wouldn't say no just because it's B2C. I'm not saying that, but there has to be a pathway forward, because otherwise I'm just giving you a false hope, and I can't retain you. So that's the other thing with accelerators. I mean, I ultimately want you to stay in our ecosystem. Now, not all of our founders have, and rightly so. We've literally put them in touch with other people in other ecosystems that would be better suited for them, because we want to see them succeed first and foremost. But, we'd love for them to stay. And in order to do that, we've got to create relationships that are going to work. And in some narrow cases, there are B2C cases that will work, but no, not a lot of new social networks probably coming out of the heart of RVA and Lighthouse Labs.
I think all those things are probably, I say that, done. We'll see. You talked about vanity metrics, and I think a lot of accelerators actually use vanity metrics as the number that's important, where capital raised, even though you just said that making money is very important. So So a lot of vanity metrics are numbers that look really good. Oh, we helped companies raise $50 million, but what if that company fails, right? And so how do you kind of understand what vanity metrics or metrics to track, and what's really important to you? Because does raising money actually correlate to making money in some of these cases?
It's a great question, for sure. Now, because of things like seed stage accelerator rankings and because of the industry in general, you can't turn a deaf ear to vanity metrics like just total amount that my portfolio is valued at or total amount that my portfolio is raised. But we like to look at, for us, of the funded companies that we've worked with, 18 of them sought outside capital, and at least the 18 that sought outside capital, they all got something. So that tells us, we're at least aligning interests. So that's important.
You've had 20 companies come through your 4 cohorts, of which 18 raised?
Yes, some dollar figure. Now, that may not be...
What's the range on
$1
that?
million every time. It could range from 50,000 to 1.2, but I mean, basically they all were seeking capital, were able to get some capital, which is rare. And I tell my investors that's not necessarily where we focus, but that just shows us alignment. So if people are able to win the argument after the acceleration and get some post-acceleration, it's more of an on-off switch than a total value. So the vanity metric would be one guy, and look, we have to do this in the accelerator industry, right? So the one guy who goes and gets $10 million is really awesome, and it helps your group average, and it is to some extent a vanity metric for the overall accelerator. But it is an outlier too. But having more of an 75% or 80% of your companies are able to at least get some traction or raise post-acceleration is the better metric for us. Right?
And I'm not saying I don't do it myself, right? I mean, we definitely have companies, right? I mean,
well, you have to, because that's how you're being evaluated by the market. So, I mean, you'd be silly not to.
I mean, we have a company that was making $60K when we started with her. Now she's doing close to $2 million. Why wouldn't I continue to sell her?
But I think you're right. I think the better metrics are revenue. Have you moved the ball on revenue? So we had a company come in with 100 ARR as a subscription-based service. They're now well over 300 ARR and raised 275 coming out. So
a month or 100
annual revenue rate. So, but tripling in the time frame. And look, that's not us. Look, accelerators don't just magically make things happen, but these are great founders that do amazing stuff. But good enough that we were able to participate in their success. And I think looking at revenue, looking at job creation to some extent, that's not always, I mean, it's a decent metric, but scale businesses often don't scale like a restaurant. So you can't really look for dollars to jobs. That's the wrong metric, but just job creation in general, not a bad thing. Jobs impacted. So we think about the broader sense of freelancers and stuff that are working alongside these companies. How many have we impacted?
I think the SBA, the numbers that they track are infusion of capital.
Yeah.
Okay, so capital formation, so a bank loan, a venture round, etc. Increase of sales, total jobs created and saved,
Yep. We do
and then
too.
long-term consulting. Is that jobs metric tough to track today when you can do a lot more with less?
Yes, like I said, one of the things that you won't see in our accelerators, so it's interesting. Accelerators, if you look at like, in my opinion, economic development authorities, and you look at like things like that, they're kind of gravitating towards trying to have, in some cases, scale startup edges, and they think that's interesting. But the reality is, for dollars to jobs, it's better probably to spend on a storefront, on a retail, on a restaurant than it is to put it into an early stage startup that's growing with technology and not growing jobs equal with the amount of capital that's coming into the organization, if you will. So we really can't go to our EDAs for funding because it's not a metric that works. So jobs isn't the best metric, in my opinion. But it is one that you have to return some value. And for us, while this is more difficult to track, we really like the total impact. So we have a number of PR firms, right? You have your marketing firms, you have your search engine optimization firms. Are they doing business with the companies that you're generating? Because if they are, you're making an overall economic impact in the job market, even though that firm, that startup itself isn't adding a +1 to the payroll. So when you look at that collateral effect, and that's really, it can be tricky to measure, but if you look at that and call that jobs, I feel more comfortable with it as a decent metric.
I think that's smart. Couple quick questions. What is traction to you?
Any customer that's paying for something. So market share traction, I don't know.
What's next for you guys? Do you guys continue to do cohort after cohort? Do you see things next? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think in general the entire industry it's going to be interesting. There's probably be some consolidation, wouldn't you think, at the top?
I,
And
I mean, I got out of it because I didn't think the model was going to work for us anymore, right? And
yeah,
I
so
think you're starting to see some businesses that are moving towards whether it's an educational play
yeah.
or something.
Yeah, I was about to say for us, I mean, there are educational pieces. I know other accelerators that have really gotten into code school pieces and tried to fix other parts of the ecosystem. I think that's on the table. But for us in the short term, it's more probably about aligning to verticals. This is obviously a trend that's happening, but we need to create a consistent stack so the top of the funnel looks like what our eventual downstream funders want to see and what our ecosystem can best support. And so for us, we'll probably stay generic with one batch, but we'd like to expand into 2 batches per year. But the second one would have to be vertical. We know we don't want to just keep making horizontal plays.
Do you
It's
have a
not
trend of
beneficial.
companies that continues to come through in a specific vertical?
Interestingly enough, we've done really well in ed tech. One of our leading companies that's been funded, it raised over 2.2 million in the ed tech space. I think that's interesting and emerging, and because we do have educational issues, from even a city perspective, you can provide a great beta opportunity for startups, and there's things to be explored there. Clearly, fintech's not off the table with a partner like Capital One and their interest. But I think we also see from the state of Virginia perspective, healthcare. Now, everyone sees that because healthcare is an industry that needs to be disrupted. And maybe that's a little bit of jumping on the bandwagon. But I think there are some unique assets with our relationships with VCU and that health system and the health systems that align in the state of Virginia and what Virginia wants to be doing that makes some sense there, on a healthcare line vertical. And the last one that I have in the back of my head, consumer packaged goods. I think it's an overlooked industry from an acceleration standpoint. It's really difficult in many ways, to be successful in that space, but it's formulaic. Their brokers, their networks, their supply chain. And I feel like if you could get the formula right, it could be pretty interesting. So CPG, because Virginia's background is making things, literally. It's our background's not thinking of things, but we'll see. Cybersecurity has already been carved out, I think, in the Northern Virginia perspective. So I don't know that we would do a ton there, but it's interesting, and I think we could see any of those verticals potentially emerge as our next kind of place to be.
No, I think that's very true. We're talking with Todd Nuckols, Lighthouse Labs, here on the 1004 show. They've gone through four cohorts and are approaching their fifth one now. A top 25 accelerator in the country from the Seat Accelerator rankings. Todd, I appreciate your time today. We'll close with another Richmond-based question.
Oh boy, I'm not, but I'm good.
So there is no professional sporting team in the state of Virginia. Will Richmond be the first, and what sport will it be?
Um, Unless it's going to be the obscure sports of maybe dodgeball or lacrosse. It won't even be soccer, but we do have a good kickers or a good soccer team. We can't even figure out where to put our stadium for our AA baseball franchise. So I'm not sure Richmond's on the verge of securing the professional. We're going to leave that to the more dense regions down where you are to procure the next professional league.
My area would appreciate that, but RVA is good at three things: beer, food, and accelerating startups. I appreciate your time, Todd Nuckols, and continued success.
Continued success in doing what you're doing. It's an inspiration. You take care of yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You bet.